to the How Do We Personalize and Not Just Automate Assessment Hangout. I'm really excited to have this panel of folks here with me today to discuss this topic. I want to start with a little bit of the purpose of why we're here together and what we're going to be doing together. So the purpose of our roundtable here is to explore the ways in which we can create and sustain authentic, personalized assessment within our classrooms, utilizing an approach that does not simply automate and make adaptive assessments happen sort of externally from the people that it most affects, the students and the teachers, but really does encourage some higher level thinking and collaboration. My hope is that you in the audience are folks who are teachers, leaders, interested in creating and using and maybe even just collaborating on authentic assessments. So I'm super excited to get started, but before we do that, I wanted to let everybody know that we do have a collaborative notes document, bit.ly/assessroundtable. If you want to hop in there, take notes all the way down at the bottom. You can see who's on the panel, and you can take part in asking questions and really thinking about all of the different things that we're talking about today. Incidentally, that Assess Roundtable is also our hashtag, so if you want to talk about it on Twitter, that's a good way of doing it. You can also submit a reflection on this session for a badge. That would be sort of towards the end or after the session if you want to do that. And if you want to create your own roundtables, you can do that as well. There's a form that walks you through that process. But I want to get started. My name is Ben Wilkoff. I'm Director of Personalized Professional Learning in Denver Public Schools. And I would like to hear from everybody that's on the panel a way in which they have personalized learning and assessment for others or for themselves in a way that feels authentic, in a way that does not feel arbitrary, automated, or otherwise non-personable. And I really am interested in how you are doing that, and maybe a story of your own experience. I'm going to save my own story after I hear everybody else's good ones, and then I'll, just make something up. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm actually going to start with Melissa. Who are you? Where are you in the world? And what's your entry point into this work of personalized learning and assessment?
Well, for about 15 years, I taught in the classroom, and I just moved to the New Jersey Department of Education in the Office of Career and Technical Education. And for authentic assessment.
What's your name?
Oh, sorry, Melissa Stager. Melissa Stager. And my title is Program Development Specialist. And one of my roles here is, there's a couple, making kids college and career ready, obviously, which is the buzzword. But I do project-based learning, and for me, that's the answer. When I was teaching last year, you talk about authentic assessment. If you design your assessment in a way that it both meets the lower level kids but encourages the higher level kids to go beyond, that's, I think, the most authentic assessment you can get, especially if you have choice-based, project-based learning.
All right, so we're going to come back probably a number of times, this idea of project or problem, or however we want to define it, learning that really does seem to be more inclusive. But I'm interested in how that gets assessed. So I want to think about those stories of, how do we make this more authentic? How do we make it a part of what we're doing? But I want to make sure that we're thinking about, well, how is that assessed? How are we driving towards, we're reflecting and able to think about our learning? So I'm going to come over to our friend Jeff. Where are you in the world? What are you working on? And what's your entry point into personalized learning and personalized assessment?
Okay. These are loaded questions. I'm glad I got to go second. So,
absolutely.
My name is Jeff Gerlach. I am an instructional designer at Michigan Virtual University in the great state of Michigan in Lansing, our capital. We are starting a brand new program called MyBlend, which is designed to support teachers in our state with blended learning initiatives. It's a combination of professional development programs and also something that I get to work on personally, our Teachers Workbench, where instructional designers work one-on-one with with classroom teachers to develop a blended plan of their own. And it's kind of bringing that design element, which I love that the project-based learning was brought up, and it has a lot of tie-ins to universal design for learning. So we do a lot of thinking about proactive personalization versus reactive personalization,
Yeah.
and that both are great elements. But trying to be as proactive.
You're going to have to define those, because I don't know what that means. Proactive versus reactive personalization. That sounds really cool.
So it's kind of borrowing from Carolyn Tomlinson in like the differentiation school of thought. But basically, proactive personalization is kind of designing for instances where you're going to need to branch students, where you're going to need to meet the needs of different students. So, for example, as classroom teachers, we want to respect the fact that classroom teachers know where the problem areas in a lot of their lessons are year after year, and through that experience, they can start to predict, exactly where certain types of students struggle with certain elements of a lesson, and where certain students get bored because it's beneath them at that point. So we try to kind of squeeze as much prediction out of where there's going to be struggles, where there's going to be kind of where different students start to branch off in different directions. Try to come up with learning objects to give them at the point of their need.
So I really like that, what you're talking about, and especially around where you are. I love the idea of that workbench that you're talking about, where you're able to work one-on-one as a designer and really being a team with a teacher. And I'm intrigued, and I want to know more about, how do you do that? What are the things that you are sort of working on with the teachers? I want to come back to that at some point. But I love that idea that you're sort of saying that the teacher has enough wherewithal to reflect and to understand and to analyze their own lessons in order to be able to identify those points of personalization. I think that's pretty powerful. So I want to come to Angela. Angela, thank you so much for being here. I know you just were teaching. So where are you in the world? What are you working on? What's your entry point into personalized learning?
Well, I am a third grade teacher here at Coons Miller Creative Arts Academy in Denver Public Schools, and I have been, let's see, personalized learning. I feel like that's what I've been doing for a while, just that's what it was called. But a lot of it is like great to hear it's project-based learning, which is, I think, beautiful. And originally, what my concern was is, like, how do I give authentic assessment for all this personalized learning? Because we want to honor those students who are asking those questions and diving deeper. And I want to give them the freedom to dive deeper while also holding them accountable for that learning. In addition to the fact that some of my students aren't there yet. They're not ready to go deeper on their own. And how do I scaffold, or how do I get it to that point where they are able to go a little bit deeper on their own and still hold them accountable for that learning, in the sense that so it's not just like at the end we're all taking this test. How do I hold them accountable during those? Not necessarily accountable, but how do I assess that they're getting what they need to get as they grow, because they're all on such different paths of growth. Because I can't expect some of my struggling readers to do some of the things that my more advanced readers are doing. And so for me, what it has resulted in is a significant amount of like one-on-one conferences, which is beautiful because I get to know all of my learners really, really well. And we sit down with their planners and we kind of write out what their next steps are going to be. So that way they're less dependent on me, but there's a goal, something to hold them accountable for in the next couple of days worth of work. But it also becomes very disengaging in that while they're waiting for me to get around to their conferencing, because I would like to think that I have a reasonable class size to be able to sustain that, but 29 students is a significant amount of students to get to on a really consistent basis. And so it becomes a little bit of a struggle. So I don't want to mainstream their assessment, but I also struggle with, like, I love the beauty of the individual conferences that I'm able to give and immediate feedback. And
well, in that relationship that you're creating with the students as you're meeting with them one-on-one, I mean, that to me is like sort of so far removed from the idea that we are automating all assessment and making it so it's sort of perfectly adaptive, but has very little to do with the humans that are in the room that really sort of are the tether to the learning. So I'm interested in that question, the one that you're asking about, how do we do this? Okay, so that's the first one that I want to come to once we sort of get through sort of everybody's introductions here. I'd love to hear Brandy. Brandy, where are you in the world? What are you working on? And you know, what's your entry point here?
I was going to be a lurker today.
I'm okay with that, Brandy, but I still need to know who you are and what you're thinking about.
All right, I am Brandy. I work for Aurora Public Schools. I am an ed tech coach. I'm currently working on some stuff with NEA called the Great Public Schools Network. I have a flipped learning group that I'm working on, and I've been trying to catch up on my blog this week as teachers are starting to wind down a little bit.
Ah, okay. So a little bit reflective at this particular moment in the year, which I like a lot. So that's really good. So I'm going to come back to you with a few questions, but you will most definitely, you are able to lurk if you like. Zach, who are you again? What do you do?
I'm an instructional technology coordinator in St. Vrain Valley School District up in Longmont and a bunch of other towns. And recently we've been working on the starting phases of rolling out a one-to-one initiative up here. So all of our secondary teachers and students will eventually have an iPad mini in their hands. And so what we realized was, hey, folks were probably going to have some questions and some learning needs that as a team of 6 we couldn't necessarily meet all the needs face-to-face. So we've created a selection of modules and are creating a selection of online modules that are self-paced and designed to be 1 to 2 hours in length for folks. And each one has an investigation section followed by application and discussion, and then a further investigation section. So an investigation being the kind of key curated resources where it's kind of, if you are interested in this topic, here are some places we can point you, and then some suggestions for application of here's something you could build and make around this learning.
So are you doing project-based learning with adults?
Yeah, it's crazy, right? But the other piece of it is that and I think that this is key because in a lot of the conversation around assessment, it sits with the teacher or the facilitator or the person who's in charge of the thing. But it's also, we designed these to be for whoever shows up to be able to say, I don't want to do the application part, right? They have assessed their learning in the moment, right? There's this self-formative assessment where they're like, you know what, that's the question I had. I got it answered. I don't need to build the thing. I don't need to get professional development credit. I just learned what I needed to learn, and now I can make the thing I wanted to make. So folks can drop in, sign up, and not finish it in an informal way, and we still count that as a success.
Well, and I think that brings about the question of what constitutes learning. You know, when we're personalizing learning, I mean, sort of, do we believe that learning, you know, it is enough to get the answer to the question, the authentic question that you had, or do we have to go beyond that? And I think a number of people have talked about where is the accountability within it. So I want to make sure that we're sort of keep on going. So it looks like we've got some questions and answers happening in the Q&A section. Dave Goodrich was just asking about, you know, where the My Blend website is, and it looks like maybe someone else from the team responded, and my hope is that link makes its way into the collaborative document, but it's essentially just myblend.org, or follow us at myblend.org. which would be on Twitter. So hopefully, Jeff, those things are recognizable to you, and those would be places you would recommend people go to find out more. Yes?
Yeah, you keep cutting out on me. But I heard some people were putting in links to myblend.org.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I'm sorry that that the audio isn't quite working out. Let me know if anybody else is having that, and I'll lower my bandwidth a little bit. All right, we're almost through, everybody. Howard, I'm going to come to you. Who are you? What are you doing? And what's your entry point here?
Hi, I'm Howard Pittler. I'm the Chief Program Officer with McCrell International, and I'm not very far from Ben here in Denver. We're doing a lot of things here trying to get around to answering the questions you're asking right now. In our thinking, a lot of it has to do with project-based learning. We're doing some work right now on engineering related to the next generation science standards and how to help build units around, project-based units around the engineering part of STEM, bringing math and science and all that stuff together. But it still comes down to that assessment part, and I think on the front end there has to be a clear agreement between the learner and the teacher, or sometimes between multiple learners. What is it that we are expecting to know and be able to demonstrate once we're done with this thing? Mm-hmm. And reaching that agreement on what that is, and then on, whether it's for the good or bad, and making sure that's aligned with what the curriculum in the school says too. That's what I think the student needs to say, here's what I really want to learn. The teacher can then facilitate how that hangs into the curriculum, and then what is an indication that I have gotten to that place. So yeah, on the front end, what is all that stuff?
Right, and I think that plays in a little bit to what Angela was talking about around sort of students making their own goals and having an understanding of what those goals are for the next few days. But I think there's kind of like an implication in there that you're saying that the students are going to want to learn the same things that the teachers need to teach. And so there are some interesting interplays there, because there are some things that I think we have agreed as educators are valuable to ask questions about and to dig in deeper within, and even to know. And so how do we make sure that that authentically happens, where the students come to those questions honestly, and we're not saying these are the questions you're going to ask and answer, right? So how do we make that happen? Before we dig into that, Katie, you were driving for a little bit. I saw a little bit of the location where you are, but where are you and what are you working on?
I am actually in Michigan as well, Jeff, and I am getting my master's right now in instructional technology via Wayne State University in Detroit. I was for a few months in Denver, but have since moved home, and I'm sure it's much prettier in Denver than it is here, as it is raining and cloudy, as usual. But before I resigned last year to go full-time with my master's, I was a high school special education teacher. And I worked primarily with students with learning disabilities, otherwise health impairments or ADD, ADHD, a few students with autism, and this topic plays directly into so much of how we try to get our general ed teachers to accept assessments in a different form or in a different way other than what they're expecting. So, for example, an essay for one of my students last year who has a writing disability, he was able to actually verbalize his essay to the teacher and then work on some other way to show that he knows punctuation and he knows how to use his verbal or put his words appropriately into into sequence, which was fantastic. But there are other teachers who are so, and I don't want to categorize them as just general ed teachers, because there are definitely some special ed teachers, all age ranges and beyond, who want to just have that straight out assessment. But allowing the kids to decide what their end result is, or decide what their project is going to be, and having the teachers go through and say, oh, well, that project is going to allow us to take this standard, this standard, this standard, and maybe like 5 to 7 different standards for science, because they made something which none of the other students would make, but they had this fantastic idea and took it upon themselves to do it.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking a lot about is how do we allow students to demonstrate their learning in different ways, right? How do we allow students to demonstrate their learning in ways that that perhaps are either not as traditional or perhaps that are I would say in multiple ways, right? You're demonstrating in multiple different ways. But I think a lot of what we talk about in personalized learning is actually the standardization of assessment in a lot of ways. It is making things a little bit more systematized so that I can have the same data points from a lot of different places and pull them into an area and make some really good educational choices about what I want to do next in my classroom. And so how do you then sort of balance those two things? How do you make it about the sort of that personalized and allow for multiple ways of demonstrating learning, but also sort of ensure that you're able to have all of the data that you need at your fingertips
to make
in order to make those educational decisions? And I'd love to hear, Melissa, what are your thoughts on that? How do we have that balance?
Well, I think you brought up a lot of good points. One of the earlier teachers talked about getting to know your students. One thing we're doing in New Jersey is NJCAN. It comes from the University of Oregon. It's the Career Information Systems, and it's standardized in a way that it's a set website, but it's individualized in the fact that students can create their own portfolios to make their plan to get to know themselves. But going back to the question that you just asked, you have to differentiate by product. You can differentiate by process, but if you do careful design, front-loading up front ahead of time, and you put in all of the standards that you are trying to meet, and as you move through, you have touch points with different groups. And I know I'm making it sound easy. It's not. It's incredibly chaotic and hard, and it requires a lot of time in the summer. But then you can allow for, like the special ed student who needs to speak the essay and indicate where the punctuation is, because the end product has so many components to it. And you're constantly giving like mini assessments every other day of 1 or 2 questions to see where they are, that personalize it. And that's someone just once said, if kids didn't have to be in school, would they go? And I think if you teach that way, the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the way what we're doing now, the answer is no.
Yeah, and I think that your point of mini assessments is super important. And you know, these things have been done for a very long time, but I wonder about what are the systems that allow for those mini assessments to actually follow that student, where they do have that portfolio of data that you're able to make decisions based upon, and some of those kinds of things. I'd love to hear, Jeff, what are you thinking about in terms of this balance? And there's an interesting point that I'll pull in from the Q&A as well, but what do you think about this balance? How do you make sure that it is truly, you know, authentic, but that you do have the right data to make decisions?
Well, I think for a lot of us, that's the big question, right? Is trying to figure out, you know, where do you balance between predicting how students are going to respond to things and how you just react to them, right? There's there's such limited time that we have to interact with students. And while I would love to just take data from assessments and have every single teacher have the ability to sit down and ask the question, what does all this mean? What do each of my students need in this situation? But it's not feasible, right? So, I mean, where it really comes in is we're asking teachers to and I forget. So far, both of the people that you've had talking didn't have the lower thirds, so I apologize that I don't remember
okay.
everyone's name.
I tried.
So I think it was Melissa that
Yes.
was you were talking about how it's really difficult to align everything to standards and predict every instance of how a student is going to respond, and then build in different branched exercises for every student to meet their needs. But this is the right kind of thinking. This is a design mentality, and the more that you can design for the unpredictable, which seems that's a great way to put this amazingly difficult task. Designing for the unpredictable is the mindset that you need to have if you're going to have personalization in a way where you'll actually have time to do little nuisances like provide qualitative feedback on a specific object that a student has produced. So I don't think of it so much as specific tools and specific processes so much that it's a thought and a mentality that that we ask teachers to have a design mentality, to try to design for as much of the unpredictable as they can, try to design for as much frequently asked questions as they can, and have those at the ready where they can fire it off at the appropriate times. I hope I can clarify anything that I'm saying. So
that actually makes a lot of sense to me when you're sort of talking about personalized learning as a mindset and defining it as as design for the unpredictable, or the frequently asked question mindset, right? I think that's actually a really interesting idea if you're because I think that traditionally, we design the lesson, and the lesson is going to go perfectly in our heads. Mm-hmm. And I think that having that mindset of what are all the things that could go wrong, or the questions that are going to inevitably come up as we proceed, and you're talking a lot about learning objects, but can we define additional paths where students can dig in deeper, where they can sort of go down the rabbit hole a little bit if they have that question. I think that's actually pretty powerful. And then sort of at the end of those rabbit holes, are there ways to assess that whether or not those were beneficial? Did they lead to the outcomes that you had for the lesson? I think that's really important. Zach, hopefully you've been able to follow. I saw you come in and out. It's okay. I'll allow it. But I'm interested in this question from Dave Goodrich. I'm curious about the panelists' balance of the inclusion of learner input in the creative process of assessment development with the need to stay focused on specific standards. So how is it that you would encourage learners and really students to be a part of the process of their assessment? And how do we do that in a way that also sort of honors the fact that we do have standards that are really important to address?
Right, and then I think you talk a little bit about the agreement of here are some things that folks need to learn, and I think that's also part of just the charge of being public schools, right? Like there's a common good, and we believe that everybody needs to know these things if we are providing for that common good. For the other side of things, they start from saying, hey, here's some stuff that you need to know. Right? Not necessarily hear the details of it, but how would I know if you learned it, right? Just asking, how would I know? And getting kids to that place and getting adults to that place of, well, I would probably be able to do this, or I would be able to build this, or this is the other side of that argument, and I could be able to tell you both of those. So it's the asking of what did you think? One of my colleagues, when I was in Philadelphia, did a great piece, a great project, looked at released test questions from the Commonwealth's standardized test, and said, gave them to the kids and said, what standard is this question asking, or is testing? Which is where many teachers will stop. And then what he said is, your project is to design a project that would assess this standard better than this question is assessing this standard. So in the end, kids built a project, designed it for other learners that said, this gets to this kind of knowing, and it does it better and more authentically, and this would be something we would like to do.
Do you have a link to where they were talking about that, or the development of that, or a blog post about that?
I do not, sadly. Yeah, this was a teacher who didn't do so much of that side of things.
Because it really does speak to, you know, so if you have figured out a way to get students to engage in a standard in a way that is truly authentic, and you're asking them and including them in the process, to me that's something that can and should be shared. You know, that's something that, I mean, I think to your point of, well, just maybe just ask them, you know, how you would do this, and to me that's where this probably ends up going, is that we involve students in the process earlier, and not so much just in the process at the end of that.
Well, it's also a deconstruction of it, right? Or the standards are a deconstruction. Like writing standards looked at what writers do and then pulled apart those skills individually and said teach them. And so then teachers believe they have to teach writing as those individual discrete skills versus doing what writers do, which is writing, and then saying, hey, how's this part of it going for you? The same thing with reading or science or mathematics. Like, what do those folks do? All right, let's just do some of that.
And so I do think that gets at authenticity in a very concrete way. I'm interested in a question that was sort of in there around how do you know when a student has learned something? And so, Angela, I'd love to hear about, in your classroom, how do you know when a student has learned something? What is it that tells you that?
I think one of the first signs that they've learned something is that they're able to talk to somebody else and help them understand it better. I think one of my favorite things is to hear them. Like a conversation, I guess, is what I'm reflecting as we're going through all of this, is really key for me as an educator, and making sure that I really do check in with my students and have a lot of conversations, which is beautiful, and also I don't have a conversation on a piece of paper. So with that being said, like when we're checking in and I'm having conversations with them, and I can see through their writing, through their math problems, through whatever it is that we're doing that day, the fact that they are able to, you know, they have the right answer, or they've mastered what I'm looking for in their writing, and then saying, hey, can you talk to your friend so-and-so who's having a little bit of a hard time with, it could be spelling, it could be with how to figure out rounding in 3rd grade is like, I don't know, it's the big mystery of the world. And so unlocked the mystery. How can you help your friend understand how you understand how to do rounding now? And empowering them to come up with different strategies without, and we talk a lot about stealing other people's learning, like don't be a math thief, don't take their learning away from them, instead help them grow understanding. And so having them, one of the biggest ways that I know that they really have mastered it is by having them demonstrate that with somebody else, and getting them to that stage of, oh, now I can teach somebody else. So that way their goal is to be able to talk about this with somebody else. And so I'm an expert on this, how can I help? Like, the kids really are empowered with great spellers. We know who our great spellers are, and we know who to go to when it's time to check our spelling. So that way I don't have 29 spelling conferences. Instead, I might have 4. And then they're able to keep track of their spelling errors, and then they create their own word list based on the words that they're consistently misspelling. So it's a lot of individual, like really personalized, this is what I am struggling with as a learner, and owning their own learning.
Yeah, I think that's actually really, really important to think about, is that it is not a one-way street as we are going down. Like, the learners should become teachers in a lot of different instances, and so perhaps the authentic assessment that we're looking for, especially in a personalized fashion, is the creation of a product that teaches someone else, is the way in which the students give back to their learning community. I think that's really powerful. So I think there's really something there. Robert, I saw you hop in here a little bit late. I'm excited that you were able to join us. Where are you in the world? What are you working on? And what's your entry point into personalized learning and assessment?
First of all, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. So I'm trying out a new headset, so I'm glad you can hear me. Robert Schutz, I'm chatting with you from suburban Chicago. I'm a technology coordinator at Palatine High School. It's a suburban Chicago high school. And so my place is in personalized learning is mainly through professional development and trying to personalize professional development, with the end game being that they can pass along those traits to their students. So far, we've dabbled in some game-based professional development and some one-on-one training and group training, but trying to impress upon folks that do-it-yourself learning is not something to be afraid of or ashamed of, that personalizing learning through social media and other internet-based environments is actually quite invigorating and exciting.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about what this looks like, and a number of folks are on that sort of spectrum of the professional learning side of things, and how do we make this a little bit more personalized from the adult perspective? Because how do we model it for the teachers that need to do it in the classroom if we're not sort of modeling it in PD? So Howard, I'd love to come to you with this question from Dave again. How do we design assessments to be authentic in the sense of including both formal and informal learning competencies? How do we make our assessments formal and informal? And especially as you have worked with schools really around the world, how do you make the case for both formal and informal? How do you make it so that it's not like, oh, it's just anything, and how do you make it so it's not just, sort of one thing as well? Howard?
Well, thanks, Ben. I think it starts with what is it exactly that you've agreed upon that the learning should be, whether it's the students picking learning goals, the district dictating that on Tuesday this is what your students will learn. However it is, it's what is it that's supposed to be learned, and then what would be indicators of progress towards that learning. We're doing some work here, a project on formative assessment. And one thing that's becoming pretty clear to us is we've worked now for 2 years on this project, is teachers don't really have really good guidance on what the assessments they're giving kids, the quizzes and the informal assessments that they're giving kids, are telling the teacher that they need to tell back to the student. So part of it is really understanding in the learning what's really happening in the student's learning that you need to provide feedback for. What can you do? What guidance can you give them to help with that? So that's one thing. In fact, I just wrote a post that hopefully will go out in our blog next week about teaching our students to fail. We want to really give kids that opportunity to try something, and then if it doesn't work, what's the feedback we're going to give them to help them get to that place? I think it's the informal assessment where we really can guide that learning the best.
Well, and that actually brings up something for me that Jeff, you talked a little bit about, and that was that essentially we don't currently have enough time as teachers to actually analyze all the data that we even have now. And so getting more data isn't necessarily going to lead to better decisions. It's sort of choosing the right pieces of data It is choosing the right places to give feedback. And so I guess I would turn that back to you guys and say, you know, does anybody have any thoughts about what is the right data to look at? What are the right places that we should be giving feedback? Angela, you're literally raising your hand.
I'm a teacher. I'm in the classroom all day. Well, one of the things that I really liked with what Melissa was saying was the like the mini assessments, and having that at your fingertips. Like a mini assessment tells me so much more than these big district standardized tests that they're making me give. And so one of the things that we did, because we are a blended learning school as well, and we're learning our way through this whole process, was the students, we had them at the beginning of the year. Since we didn't receive our technology till halfway through the year, at the beginning of the year we had them starting on number of the day. Here's our number in the thousands, what's 10 more, 10 less, 100 more, 100 less. And then what I was able to do was create a Google form for the kids to fill out, so they could still do the process like on whiteboards and erase and then put their work into the Google form. But the beauty of it was that I got automatic data. As soon as they entered into the Google form, I was able to have it graded, so that way before even some of the other kids were done, I was able to go and have a conversation with 3 or 4 students and get them, check their thinking, and then get back into it, but only on the part that they needed help on. So I'm not going through and because I think the gathering of the data is what's cumbersome. But if the data, because the data was already gathered through my Google form, I was able to see, okay, this group of students is struggling with 100 more and 100 less. So I was able to pull and personalize their learning for what they actually needed. Instead of teaching the whole class 100 more, 100 less, I was able to do that. So the little bits of data that I'm able to collect with that mini assessment is far more beneficial than waiting for these big giant tests, because it's those little steps, I feel, that help me be a better and more responsive educator. So I'm able to respond to their little bodies on a really immediate, more personal level. And unfortunately, it's not, I mean, with math, it's easy. It's a cut and dry yes or no kind of thing. With writing, it's a little bit more difficult to do. But I have found that with my math instruction, having those mini assessments and not necessarily having tons more data, but I'm able to see the growth, and they're able to see the growth with the feedback that the Google Forms also allows me to give them. So that was one of the very beautiful things that I have learned this year and has made me more effective, I feel.
Well, and
Can I add something to what Angela just said, Ben?
Please.
One thing that we see a lot is, and I totally agree with what she's saying, that informal, those pieces of feedback along the way, but we also have to help teachers be comfortable with the idea that they don't give a lot of feedback at once, that you want to give the kids 1 or 2 pieces of feedback for them to act upon and then bring the work back. That's something that we're really strong about, is if you give kids 8 or 9 things that they need to work on, they feel overwhelmed. So here's the next thing you need to do. Now bring that back and let's see how that helped you.
Well, and you're talking then about the feedback loop that you're creating, and you're able to sort of construct that. You know, I find you know, that rather than talking about almost this personalized assessment or sort of adaptive assessment, you're talking about adaptive grouping at that point. You're really talking about how do we more intelligently group and make decisions about the ways in which we group students and around ideas. Mr. Zach Chase.
I want to turn it around a little bit and kind of come at it from more of a constructionist kind of bent, right? What are kids trying to do? Like, and hopefully that they're doing a thing that they would like to get done, and saying, hey, did it work? Did you get done what you wanted to? No. All right. Then the product, the thing you are making, has given you the feedback you need. What was it, and what do we need to figure out from there? I find the more that I give feedback, the more that my feedback is sought. And that's not super helpful, I guess. Right? Because I also want my students to be able to analyze the situation and say, what was I trying to do? And I know that this looks different depending on the level. But if I'm asking my student to do something authentic and to create something authentic, then all I really need to do is say, hey, did that do what you set out to do? And if the answer is no, then there's the feedback that's necessary, or at least the start of the feedback process.
I think the other important thing is, again, going back to that conversation, is having students like explain to you where they went wrong. That's probably one of my favorite tools to use with them, is really saying, okay, so this was your answer before. It's not right. Something's wrong in there. And then go try to make it right. Not, this is exactly where you went wrong. It's, there's something wrong here. See if you can figure it out and fix it. And when they come back saying, okay, now tell me what you did wrong, or tell me what went astray, or tell me why this didn't work the first time, and really putting that ownership back on them. Because if I have found when students come to me and the first time I ask them to explain to them what happened, they look at me like I'm crazy. And then as we progress through the year, they understand that this is my learning, and I'm really responsible for making that what failed. How did I fail? Because failure is okay. Failure is how we learn, and frustration is learning. That happy feeling is knowing. And so why were you frustrated? What happened to get you to that happy feeling? So really allowing them to share verbally or written, however, whatever type of expression, saying, no, this is what I did wrong, and this is what I had to do to make it correct. And I said, okay, so how is this going to help you for the next time? Like preparing them so that way they're not making this, because I could circle the same mistake 20 times, but until they become aware of which mistakes they're making, it doesn't do them any good. I'm not doing them any favors as an educator.
I would add in there, we don't do that with teachers very well. If you think about most delivery mechanisms for how we help teachers learn, we're often just telling them, here are the steps, here's what you need to do, please follow these directions, versus, hey, how's your class going? Oh, not so great today. Why do you think that was? Right? Exactly the same steps you're talking about there. Right? Like, oh, this didn't work? Why do you think it didn't work? Why don't you go figure that out? Versus, I observed your class and you did not do this, and this is why it went wrong. Right? There's no thinking going on there. So we're removing that process in the same way that we don't want to remove that process for kids.
Well, and there are two things there. So one of the things that we've been sort of talking around a little bit is that sort of reflection is the through line for all of this. Like when a student is reflecting or when a teacher is reflecting upon their practice, like the learning can sort of improve, or the practice can improve. And back to Jeff's point of even being able to predict things, the only way that you do that is through the process of reflection. And then the second thing, I really love this idea of frustration as learning and happy feeling as knowing. I don't know that I've ever heard that sort of put quite like that, and it just makes me really glad to know that that's how we are framing it in the classroom. You know, that we're saying that this frustration feeling of like not knowing and like trying to know is that's the learning. Oh, you're learning right now. Like that's really kind of powerful. And then that sort of act of knowing or getting to that place of knowing gives you that happy feeling of, and I think that's why I find learning almost addictive in that way. And so I want to come, Robert and a couple of other folks have kind of been talking a little bit about sort of how important the informal learning process is and that reflection process and things like that. I'm interested to hear a little bit more about embracing, not embarrassing, embracing informal learning.
Could you repeat the question?
So Robert had put in the post there about a recent post about embracing informal learning. Robert, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just been doing some recent reading and have been interested in self-determined learning and life-wide learning. Bringing in the aspects for with respects to the whole learner. So you talk about frustration or something. So if they're trying, you have a baseball player trying to hit a curveball, or you have piano lessons, you have outside experiences that can be connected to what would happen in more formal learning settings or classrooms, that this opens additional avenues for personalization of learning. So
I think that also connects back to what Zach was talking about. All of those activities that you just mentioned, the feedback is within the doing of those activities.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think, how do we make the doing of learning the process of giving feedback? Robert, does that make sense?
Absolutely. And a revelation I had is coming across a graphic and coming to the realization that 2/3 or more of our lives are spent immersed in informal learning, that the guidance goes away and then we become responsible for our own learning. And now those avenues for informal learning are growing exponentially by the day. So by embracing informal learning, what I'm really saying is that we make a concerted effort to help all of our learning stakeholders learn how to learn and learn how to think, because eventually when the formal learning cord is cut, they'll be on their own.
And that's so true, right? Like, how do we do that? And Jeff, I'd love to come back to you, and some things that you were talking about, really resonate with me, and another comment from Dave here around how should you plan for serendipity? How should we be planning our lessons? How should we be planning our year in order to make these possibilities a reality, and in order to make reflection, adaptive grouping, and sort of this personalized version of assessment? How do we make that a reality for not that you have to have all the answers, but what are you thinking?
Yeah, because again, that's a huge rabbit hole that you go down, right? Planning for serendipity seems like an oxymoron. I got into in educational technology and using educational technology in my own classroom for a different reason than a lot of people do. I love leveraging technology for to enhance my humanity rather than take it away. And I guess that the biggest thing that I see technology being able to do is reach more students in a personal way. So rather than you can put content in any sort of space and have students interact with that content, but unless you're building in feedback loops, and unless you're I love the idea that has just been talked about, intentionally making your design set up so that the goal of learning is the learning itself, and that when you are interacting with certain elements of a teacher's course, that it's actually giving you feedback by actually participating. That's the most efficient way of giving feedback, I think, and the most efficient way to drive students' own learning. Because if we can get students in their own headspace, and somehow through learning inspire them to drive their learning forward in different pathways, that's the greatest way to encourage serendipity, right? Because then they're no longer concerned about you, no longer concerned about whoever made whatever lesson they're interacting with. They're driving learning forward. And so if we're thinking about, I'll say one more thing, and then I'll give the floor over to you, Zach. If we're really thinking about putting students in their own headspace and getting them to kind of, it was mentioned that we need to have them think about their own learning and how to learn. If we empower them to drive their own learning, that will take care of a lot of this big responsibility that the teacher has and put it on the students.
Nice. Zach, what do you got?
I was just going to kind of flip that language a little bit and say kind of stop getting in the way of that serendipity. Right. They come to us in their headspace. They come to us curious. They come to us with all of these things. So it's really designing a classroom where we don't put those blocks into place.
Nice. And I'm going to take that as a really good sort of challenge for us, right? So we should be challenging one another to not get in the way of the learners. And I'm going to ask this final question to everybody. What are the other challenges that we should be setting forward for one another? And I say this on every roundtable. We are now connected in a way that we weren't before. We are now a community, both of people who are on the panel here and the viewers who have watched and the ones who watch next year. We are in a community that can collectively do something. So I think that challenge from Zach makes a lot of sense. What are the other challenges that we should be making for one another? And I'm going to get to everybody. So Angela, what's the challenge that you would like to state for us as simply and short of a couple sentences as possible?
That's too much pressure, Ben.
Sorry.
A question that I would like to challenge. Well, I think it's really, for me, is like honoring the teacher and honoring the student through assessment, because we're beat down with the amount of assessment that happens. And I think it's really like, how can we find a way to both honor the teacher and honor the student as both wanting to get to the same goal without beating us all the way that we get there. Like, I think that would make my teacher heart happy.
I like that. Brandy, I'm going to come to you. You've got to have your final word. What's your challenge for all of us? Oh, you got to unmute. You got to unmute.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, so I really like what Angela was saying about honoring the student and honoring the teacher. We have so many different types of students out there who are good at so many things that traditional assessments don't assess for, and we're not honoring them if we're only assessing them in one way. And our poor teachers out there are so crunched for time, and it takes time to analyze and look at what each individual student needs for assessment. So how can we carve out that time for teachers so that we are honoring them, and how can we look at alternative ways to assess students so that we honor their individuality and their strengths instead of being so weakness-based?
Like that. Thank you. Howard, what do you got?
I'd like to challenge us to rethink the paradigm of teacher-student to one of coach and coachee. That we're not, we all share in the process, and our job is to help everyone make minor improvements to performance constantly.
Nice. Thank you. Jeff, what's your challenge for us?
I guess my challenge is to think intentionally about the problems that arise in your classroom. Try to get the most frequently answered questions handled, and then constantly be reinforming your design year after year about what goes on. Free yourself up to have a reactive feedback loop with your students, rather than getting bogged down in all the big things that could get out of the way with design.
Nice. Katie, we haven't heard from you in a little while. What's your challenge for us?
Challenge would be possibly taking your time and utilizing the resources that are other teachers that are there in your building, who may, at least for the special ed teachers, who know your students who need differentiating a lot. We work with all of them, and so many of the things you guys have been discussing. I have a student with or I had a student with one of the many issues or assessment dilemmas or delays or problems that I've had to think of different ways to get around their disability in order for them to be on the same playing field as all the other students in their general ed class. And I've worked with that. That's what a lot of my job is. But reach out to us, because that's part of what we love doing, is helping you guys so that our students can be more successful with you in the general ed class instead of
leveraging leveraging all of the teachers in the network and in the school. I think that's huge, and all of the expertise really in the learning community. I love that. I love that. Melissa, what do you got?
Well, we have a lot of like-minded people here, obviously passionate about education. So my challenge is, how do you spread this to someone who might not have the same enthusiasm and mindset that's presented here? So my challenge is to go out and, I know they're smiling, I know how hard it is, but be that devil's advocate in the faculty room. Show what great things that you are doing over and over again, so they can't help but get excited. I guess basically show how great and how powerful this stuff is, so others, the challenges, so others will follow.
That's amazing. Thank you. And I'm going to say, Robert, I'm going to give you the final word here.
Thanks, Ben. I like what Howard said earlier as far as learning coach and co-learner. I would say embrace the role of co-learner or master learner, modeling, bringing personalized learning into whatever learning environment you have, whether it be with the adults or with the younger people, and share the joy and the thrill of being a learner.
Thank you all so much for taking part today. This truly has been one of my favorite conversations, and like I said before, you are all together as a learning community now. We will continue to use the collaborative notes document, so anything that you found helpful, pop it in there. If you do want to submit a reflection for a badge that follows you on your digital learning journey, you can use that link, and it's also in the doc. And then if you want to create your own roundtables, if you want to do this on your own topics, you can do so from that link. It's a Google form that'll walk you through the whole process, have you creating your event, and everything like that. So I really appreciate all of your time. I'm just going to close out these last couple of questions. You can stick around for that or not, but thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ben. This was amazing.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, everyone.
And the reason why I did not choose to ask and answer the question from Gordon, it's a really important one. Do we have a common understanding of what constitutes personalized learning? The answer is no, and that's okay, because we don't need to have the same definition for personalized learning, but it is good to have the conversation. And to me, by having the conversation, we actually get closer to some common understanding, but I don't need a common definition necessarily. And then the last one was from Dave. What might be important to emphasize formative assessment as part of the learning process above summative measures? How do formative assessments support summative ones? That is a huge question. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that one that's still on the call.
So it's, how does formative assessments inform summative assessments?
Yeah.
Summative, I don't even know if they're necessary. I hate to say that because I know a lot of the testing is. But if you're constantly doing formative assessments, I think Angela said it earlier, why am I going to reteach my kids something that they already know? If they've proven mastery over and over and over again, and you've done it in different ways, like through the essay and through the things, I think the idea of the traditional test isn't necessary. So I guess I didn't answer the question. I just said don't think of summative assessments, think of formative.
I would disagree on that one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and more thinking of it from a project-based approach, right? The summative assessment is whatever you've created at the end.
Right.
So the formative assessment for me would be each of the smaller pieces as the piece thing gets built. And so my summative assessment is, can you put these all together and understand it as a cohesive whole?
But don't you think it's also formative, though, in a way, because it's an end product, but they're not done because they have to realize. I think everything
is a formative assessment. I think that a product at the end, right? Like at some point you have to say we're moving on to the next set of things or the next big questions, rather than like we will write the best.
Life is a formative assessment.
Yeah.
Well, I would totally agree. Like formative assessment to me looks a lot like learning, right? It's that. It's information, and it's the checkpoint, knowing that you understand as a learner, keeping tabs on your students as a teacher, and using those formative assessments to guide them appropriately towards their end goal, and then the summative, and essentially preparing them for not just the summative assessment, but for beyond that, right?
Yeah, I guess I also think of it as like if you're building a house, like I put the windows up, that's a formative assessment. But at the end, do I have a house would be my summative assessment. Versus
well, the
like,
formative assessment part of that would be, did you put the windows in correctly?
right.
Right.
Is there water that's going to leak through these windows? I'm going
Right.
to spray the garden hose at the outside of the window. You stand on the inside and tell me if any water has trickled in.
That's a
Right.
great
And
point.
I hear a blog post in the offing right here.
No.
I'm charging all of you to go and write one now. That could be your summative assessment for this this roundtable. I appreciate all of your time. I have to go to some other things. I really appreciate your time today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
You
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Bye.